welcome to Indianomics. By far the most important data set provided by the NSO, the National Statistics Organization, is the All India Household Consumption and Expenditure Survey. The results of the latest survey done between August 22 and July 2023 have just been released. These surveys tell us what Indian families consume. And it is based on this data that the CPI inflation index and even the GDP is constructed. What makes the latest survey special is that it comes after an 11-year gap, because an intervening survey, one done in 2017, was controversially cancelled. So, what are the key takeaways from this much-awaited survey? I have with me three top economists to decode that. Mridul Saggar, Professor of Finance and Macroeconomics at IIMK and former Reserve Bank of India member of the Monetary Policy Committee. Soumya Kanti Ghosh, Chief Economic Advisor at State Bank of India. And Samiran Chakraborty, Citi India's Chief Economist. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sparing time for me. Samiran, I want to start with you because I just have your report, and your first takeaway is that the growth in consumption from 2011-12 to 22-23 was slower than the growth in consumption in the previous 8 years. If you can elaborate.
So, Latha, if you look at the current survey for 2022-23 and compare it with 2011-12 numbers, and then compare 2011-12 with the 2004-5 numbers, what comes out quite clearly is that the nominal growth in expenditure for both rural and urban have slowed down in the 2011-12 to 2022-23 period. And if you adjust it for inflation, then the gap is narrower. So in other words, inflation was higher in the 2004-5 to 2011-12 period. So to that extent, it gets counterbalanced. And we get that the real growth in consumption in rural and urban areas is about 3.2 and 2.8% respectively for the 2011-12 to 2022-23 period. But we also note that this is substantially lower than the real consumption growth that we find in the GDP data. The GDP data is actually showing close to a 6% consumption growth all through this period without much deviation between these two subcomponents. And we also find that this consumption growth, the nominal consumption growth for rural and urban, is slower than the nominal household disposable income growth that we have seen between 2011-12 and 2022-23, which is quite perplexing in a period when household leverage has actually gone up.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I guess survey data and, the holistic data like GDP or national income are likely to differ. But Soumya, this slight slowing of the pace of growth, let's be under no mistaken assumption of the growth itself. Consumption is clearly growing across all categories, across all fractiles, bottom five, top five, any category you take, growth is very much there, but it's a little slower than the previous term, the previous 8 years. But Soumya, perhaps it is more because of COVID, you think?
Yeah, Latha, I think I'll just add a little bit different perspective what Samiran said. My point is that I think the first thing from the survey data, when you look into the survey data, actually it shows that the rural is actually doing better than the urban, in fact, much better than the urban. So this is the first thing which comes out of the data. The second important point which comes out from the data, and that actually includes the COVID period, is that if you look into the difference of the rural and the urban consumption expenditure as a percentage, you will find that the ratio is down from 90% to 70% across all fractile classes. And the important point to note is that at the lowest fractile classes, which is basically the 0 to 5 and the 5 to 10%, this gap is lower than 50%, indicating that what is happening in the rural side is perhaps the government programs which is running, that is having a salutary impact at the bottom end of the pyramid. So therefore, when you compare this inequality within the rural class, across different factors, you will also find that there is a decline in the vertical consumption inequality. So in whatever sense you look into the data, I'm not talking about the nominal and the aggregate sense, but in terms of the inequality and the vertical sense within rural, within urban, and across horizontal also rural to urban, that shows distinct decline.
All right. I'll come to inequality in a bit. I first wanted growth, but the next most important thing has to be inflation. And we have a former MPC member, so straight away to you, Mridul. The CPI index is created out of the survey results. So if you can parse the results on that ground, we should see a lower weightage for food, is it, in the coming indexes?
Well, definitely, yes, Latha. I mean, the weight of food will fall. I mean, it was something known to us that since the 2017-18 survey is not available, there could be upward bias on the inflation arising from the food. But like looking into the data, my impression now is that upward bias may not be very large in that period. So we are seeing here a phenomena where sort of like, yes, there has been a shift away from the cereals, but the share of food has not fallen all that much as one would expect from the Angel's law. When this transition really takes place, I mean, with growth, obviously for every country, the share of food would fall. And that's what we are seeing because the gap is like 11 years. So the numbers may look a little stark. I mean, the delta which exists of over 6 percentage points. But then there is this shift away from cereals, but it's also in favor of milk, protein items and stuff. So one has to wait and watch. See, the CPI revisions is not going to come very quickly. I mean, there's still work at hand. I mean, we as users expect that the moment numbers are out, we should have the mystery all clear. I mean, it's also noticeable that only, 22, 23 results have come out. It's yet to be corroborated by the follow-up survey next year, I mean, in the coming year. So the NSS round is not available.
So the July 2024, I guess those surveys will be done and they will have to corroborate the 22-23 survey. But, Mridul is making a very important point. Even now, 46% of a rural household's income or consumption is constituted by food. I mean, one would assume that as economies progress and prosper, you will spend less on food and more on others. 46 is still very large, though it is much less than the 52% 11 years ago. It is still a large number. That point is well taken. But Samiran, see, what is the Reserve Bank's state of mind at this point in time? Core inflation is falling rapidly at 3.6%, and food inflation is sticking high at 8.6%. Now that the weightage of food ought have been lower, even from 23 onwards, then the Reserve Bank should logically be in a better position to cut or at least be dovish, isn't it?
So, Latha, we have taken a stab at this problem by trying to recalculate last 3 years inflation numbers based on the current shares of different items that have come from the Household Consumer Expenditure Survey. I'm not saying that this is a perfect analysis. Even in the past, the shares in the Consumer Expenditure Survey versus the share in CPI have not perfectly matched. And as Mridul was mentioning, there is going to be another round of this survey later this year. But with all those caveats, we see that over the last 3 years, the average difference between the newly constructed CPI and the old index is between 30 to 40 basis points, which is not a very large one. Also, one needs to be careful that going forward, we are all expecting headline CPI to come off, primarily because of food converging towards core. So if the share of food actually comes off in the index, then to that extent, the decline in inflation will be relatively lower than what we were factoring in. So that's also another way to look at it, not just to say that food being lower means that headline inflation would be lower. But I must say that with a lower share of food, the volatility on the inflation estimate should be going forward that much lower.
No, I want to persist with this, Soumya. Like Samiran also pointed out, I would assume that if food is not 46% of the basket, at the moment it's 45.9. If you take the current average of the new survey results, then it should logically come down to about 42 or 43%. So if what Samiran says is exactly what the RBI thinks, that, you know, the CPI index is about 30, 40 basis points lower, then we should be more comfortable with lowering rates, isn't it?
We are currently looking at a declining inflation trajectory. So, we also compared the inflation numbers in an increasing inflation trajectory and in a declining inflation trajectory. If you remember, when the inflation was increasing, I think it was 7.8% at the beginning of when the RBI started to raise the rates. That number, if you recalculate by using the today's rates, that number actually goes up to 8%.
Okay.
But if you recalculate with the current rates, the latest number of 5.1% goes down to 4.8%. So over a point of time, as the share of food declines, but if the share of core increases, so that means that it will average out.
Okay.
So on the net, we actually currently the inflation will look much better because the inflation is declining. But once it starts rising, I think in that case, the inflation number could be a little bit higher than it's currently being rated.
Okay.
So that's going to be the overall trend.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the nearer term. Around mid 2024, the Reserve Bank's own forecast is 4% inflation for the third quarter. And if food is actually lower, then perhaps we will get a sub-4 number, technically speaking, and therefore will the Reserve Bank be a little more comfortable. In any case, core inflation is declining even because of global factors like China. But let me come back to the data. The more important point is what is the learning on poverty, what is the learning on inequality, and what is the learning on the breakup of consumption, how much is being spent on consumer durables, the other takeaways. In a minute, we are back after a break. Welcome back. We've been discussing the latest All India Household Consumption Expenditure Survey with three important economists: Mridul Saggar, former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, Samiran from Citi, and Soumya Kanti Ghosh from State Bank. Gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Mridul, what have you made of the other takeaways in terms of the composition of consumption? We find conveyance, families are spending much more on conveyance and much more on consumer durables as well. What will you take away as an economist from these?
So one thing is very clear, that basically what we knock out of for the core, the food and fuel, its weight is going to fall. But that doesn't really leave us with much comfort, because conveyance, as you rightly mentioned, its weight has gone up steeply. And also rents, for that matter. The rents have gone up steeply also. So what we might see is that the core inflation, once you knock that off, the transportation part of it, so that may not necessarily fall as much. So one has to wait and see the final numbers and see that. And since you mentioned about the income inequalities and all, I would there hold my thoughts a bit. I mean, we still don't have the unit level data. So unless the full survey is made and the unit level data is made available, I won't run to form judgments on that. I have read the statement from the Niti Aayog CEO that probably party estimates will go down below 5%. Some extrapolation may suggest that, but that number looks to be too dramatic a fall. So it has to be corroborated by the unit level data. And then,
in that case, you have not read Surjit Bhala's article in the Mint, which has argued for a much more, or argues that the poverty level has fallen much more. But I'll come to Soumya in a minute on that, since he has written elaborately on poverty. I wanted this point on education, Samiran. How do we interpret this? It's extremely painful that families are spending less on education, both rural and urban areas, and actually fallen for 3 consecutive surveys. This is not a... Does this sound very happy when you're sitting on supposedly the cusp of demographic dividend?
Well, Latha, there are quite a few such surprising nuggets in the data if you dig deeper into it. So this is one of them. One possible explanation could be that now the universalization of education with Right to Education Act implies that a lot of education is provided for free, which is why this is not showing up in the data as an additional expenditure. But other than that, I don't see how with education inflation running in around 5-6% on an average, the actual share of education in total spending to come off in consecutive surveys.
Okay. If that is the interpretation, that there's more free education provided, it's a positive one. But otherwise, this looks like an underinvestment in education. I always thought that Indian families made up for what the government was not, but this was a bit disappointing. Soumya, on the question of poverty, the lowest fractile also has moved up, and Surjit Bhalla argues that if you take the IMF definition in 2011 of $1.7 as the per capita income cutoff, then if you extrapolate it to 22-23, poverty is almost completely eradicated. It goes down to 2% or something. And if you take an even higher on PPP basis, a purchasing power parity basis, a $3.2 poverty level, then even then poverty has fallen by about 30 percentage points, is what he argues. What are your observations on the reduction in poverty?
I think, Latha, we had tried to take a stab at these poverty estimates. See, what we have done is that we have looked into the poverty lines which were done in 2011 and 12. Actually, it was around 816 in rural areas and 1,000 in urban areas. So what we did is that on the top of that, we added an escalation factor of the rural CPI and the urban CPI. And we also added the imputation factor. Our numbers are in fact higher than what the Niti Aayog had said. Niti Aayog had said that the total CAGR in rural and CPI and urban CPI was around 5.6 and 5.7%. So once you add that escalation factor, you get into the revised poverty line definition for 2022-23. Then you compare that with the fractal distribution. But there is one catch over here. The population numbers for 2021 has not been released. So if we use the population ratio, which is given in the MPC documents of rural and urban, you arrive at a rural poverty rate of around 7.2% and urban poverty rate of around 4.6%. Aggregate is not possible to do at this point of time because the detailed data is not available. So if you take an average of that, that makes the number closer to 5%. Just the thing is that these numbers could be revised later because once this metadata is available and then the population number is available, the numbers could actually look a little bit upper or low or high or low depending on the ratio of the rural to urban. But this looks to us a reasonable estimate as far as estimation goes.
No, it's always a consoling factor if extreme poverty has been eradicated, and several experts seem to suggest that. Mridul, if you want to comment, I mean, let's not comment on inequality. I take your point that that's difficult. If you want to comment anything on what are the takeaways for poverty, and also separately on this conveyance issue, I mean, does it conveyance expenditure for both rural and urban areas has really shot up? I mean, trebled almost over the last 10 years. What does this really signify? Does it mean that people are, going more mobile, therefore, traveling more? Or does it mean that people are resorting to public transport because private transport because public transport is terrible? Are there any implications for policy over here?
Yeah, there are clear. One thing is very clear that the mobility has gone up. But you asked me not to talk of inequality. I hadn't actually talked of inequality.
Okay, please go
I
ahead.
only mentioned the poverty part.
Okay.
And poverty part, I agree, has dropped steeply. All I want to say is the final numbers could still depend on the detailed data. So let's hold on. The income inequality, I want to make one point that we don't have data to look at within group inequalities. At the moment, we know what is the inequality from the overall numbers. The within group inequalities will have to be calculated to understand whether income distribution is becoming worse or favorable or whatever it exists. Now, coming to the transportation, sorry.
Yeah, I thought you were talking on conveyance.
Yeah, the conveyance part. So this is but natural that the mobility has gone up. If we would have done the survey during the COVID period as initially planned, then these numbers would have gone very awry. So having skipped the 2017-18, it was a right decision to wait for the following years to see once the COVID effects are off.
Okay.
And that is there. Education, I'm still not very sure because private education costs have gone up dramatically during this period. And therefore, at least in nominal terms, the number should have been high. Even in real terms, the number should have been higher. But I don't know. I don't want to doubt survey because it has been done with professional intelligence and stuff. So we'll wait and see because...
what to learn from it. No, I take your point.
Yeah.
2.6 lakh families is not a joke. Finally, Samiran, this inequality bit, consumption, how much can a richer person consume over a poor person? Okay, 10 times more. But that doesn't mean inequality is lower. Inequality is really a question of income and wealth, hardly consumption. So should we run away with inequality, derivatives from this data?
I mean, there are different kinds of inequality. There's a consumption inequality, there is income inequality, there is wealth inequality. Each one of them have their own merits and demerits to track. So in some sense, what Soumya was mentioning is a very important point, which is that the extreme poverty has been reduced substantially, which in turn, from a consumption inequality perspective, is a good thing to happen. But we also note that there is still a large gap between the top 5% of the population and the bottom 5% of the population, where their consumption is almost 10 times higher in urban areas. So there is always scope for improvement even on the inequality side. But I will not completely show this consumption inequality data just because I don't have income inequality or wealth inequality data, which in an ideal world might be more important to track.
Okay. Well, we are out of time, but thank you very much for a very rich discussion. Clearly, the important takeaway is that the Indian economy has progressed at all levels, and therefore people are spending less on food and more on consumer durables. That is reflected in the fact that politicians hereafter will promise less of food and more of electricity because you have to run the consumer durables. So you can clearly see it even in political preferences. This is the first of the discussion we are having on the household consumption data. As more becomes available after July, we will have more exhaustive discussions. Thank you very much, Samiran, Mridul and Soumya, for this enriching discussion. We wrap up on Economics.